We all know where real wealth is found: real estate. Yet investing in real estate is such an intimidating process, and for those of us who've never dipped our toes in it before, or even maybe not even ever bought a house before, we can find ourselves asking the question, what the heck do I need to know, and what does this process even look like? Well, in today's episode, we have Jenny Wellington on the podcast. She's the branch manager at our local, how about that? At our local mortgage company here in Northwest Arkansas. She is an incredibly savvy business owner in her own right, and it was a total joy to sit down with her, learn more about the mortgage industry. And for those of you who've been thinking about making an investment in the near future, you're going to love today's episode. You're going to learn a lot about how the mortgage industry is done, and more importantly, some tips about being smarter when it comes to your next entrepreneurial venture. You can always find out more information from Jenny on her website or from her LinkedIn page. You can connect with her there. I'll put those links in the episode description below. Enjoy this interview. And before we dive in, we have a word from one of the incredible businesses that sponsors the podcast. Check this out. We'll be right back soon. There's one single piece of advice that I give to business owners who are ready to scale their business drastically. And that's knowing exactly what you need to hand off so that you can continue focusing on what you're an expert in. It amazes me when I talk to business owners who are doing their own bookkeeping and tax prep, and worse, that they're going through all this paperwork at 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, even midnight, slaving away trying to make sense of all of the numbers for their business. Business owners who are making it happen have already figured out that you can't do it all yourself. That's why I recommend Steve Lay with Equity Business Solutions. Not only is he an expert in bookkeeping and tax prep, but what I love about Steve is that he'll sit down with you and help you make sense of the value of your business beyond just reading a spreadsheet. You'll be able to make better decisions, and more importantly, you're going to save yourself the crucial time you would have spent going through QuickBooks or an Excel spreadsheet or whatever it is that keeps us up late at night. So save yourself some time and some money by giving Steve Lay a call at Equity Business Solutions, and he'll show you the value beyond your numbers. Go to equitybusinesssolutionsllc.com to find out more. Jenny, it's so great to have you on the podcast today.
Thank you, Blake. I'm really excited to be here.
It's so fun how we got to know each other because you've been coming to the Tuesday morning growth group, and it's funny because we've talked a lot about like realizing what you don't know versus what you do know, and listening to you give advice at our Tuesday morning group. I'm just like, man, this person really understands and appreciates business. I don't know if you always feel that way, but
of course not.
Anyway,
but I appreciate you saying that.
Yeah. Well, so it's great to have someone on the podcast who understands business, who's going to definitely share some good advice today. The listeners have heard my intro about you. Why don't you give us sort of the crash course on who you are, what you're doing with Lower Local, and then we'll go from there.
So I have been in the mortgage industry for 10 years. And I've run pretty much the whole gambit of all of the things that really have brought me to this moment. So I started as an originator, meaning I helped people find the right loan for their house. I worked briefly as an assistant for a high producing loan officer, which taught me an insane amount of information at a very short period of time, which I think was probably really it was like jumping into the deep end of the pool.
Yeah.
But I'm really grateful for that moment. And then because a lot of times in our industry, it's a sink or swim. Like here, you got your license, but now you got to go out there and figure out business, and you're not really sure what to do with people or the numerous amount of products that you can put them in. I started to automatically, when new people came into our branch, I started to go, hey, let me tell you how not to run into this situation, or let me just give you a heads up on what you need to know about helping people. And that transitioned me into being the training director for our company. It was a national company out of Dallas. And then that company, who I loved, I was with them for 10 years, closed their doors in December, this past December, 23. And that left me at a pretty big crossroads personally and, career-wise. I loved my position. I loved helping people. I was bringing on new loan officers. I was growing them. I was teaching them. I was watching them flourish. And that's something really, of all the things I do, I love to see people succeed. And I love helping them do that. And so I sat down with my husband and said, our options, and I kind of already, we'd moved to Northwest Arkansas a little over a year ago. And I'd noticed that there was some opportunity here to open a branch and bring, the type of lending that we do to this area. There's a lot of banks in this area, but we can offer, a little bit more flexibility in product and opportunity for people. So I sat down and I said, we have 2 small girls. And I said, if I start this branch, bringing all of these things together, the training, the origination, the high fast-paced branch, that's doing a lot of business. If I bring all of these things together and open a branch, it's going to take a lot from our family. Are you okay with that? Because it is.
Yeah, I had the same conversation with my wife, and I feel bad because I don't think I really understood everything it would take.
Yeah.
And she definitely didn't understand either. And so here we are 6 years later, and she comes on my podcast probably every 50 episodes or so. And it's always the conversation on okay, if I could go back and know what I know now, what would I do differently? And even this comment on, this has been a trend on social media on if I had to do it over. And a lot of people have used this as a sales thing of if I had to do it over, I would do this. And by the way, buy my book. But I don't know if I would do it again just because it's been so much work. But you've been in the thick of it. You've been in the grind.
Ignorance.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
So, but I want to go backwards a little bit. You mentioned, I think you're pointing out a really interesting thing in the world of entrepreneurship and business ownership, in that when people think about entrepreneurship, a lot of times what they think about is I'm creating something new. And so what happens is someone comes to the area and they say, oh, there's already a mortgage company here, so why would I do that? Rather than what you noticed, which was, and it's not necessarily throwing shade at anybody, but I see an interesting opportunity here that I'm willing to explore. For you, what were some of those things that you thought, you know what, this is interesting. This is an interesting thing to hang my hat on in terms of, I want to do a mortgage company that does this or focuses on that. What did that look like for you?
Yeah. So kind of as I was, learning about the area, like I mentioned before, this is a very bank-centric area. So a lot of what I've come to learn even beyond that.
What does that mean, by the way?
Literally banks. So the big banks, the Arvests, they do primarily the lending in this area. Yeah. And so there's actually a lot of misconception about what's required to get a mortgage loan. And I'm not saying that, we don't do it. There's none of that subprime stuff, no doc things. But because we sell directly to Fannie and Freddie, our overlays, meaning things that we require to get a loan done. For instance, I'll give you an example. We only need 2 months bank statements, if that. Whereas some of the banks will require 6 months. And so, you don't have to have 20% down.
I'm very familiar with this as a business owner because it's always so goofy on well, show me the last 6 months. And it's well, it's varies greatly.
Right. And business owners, we can do banks off of bank statements alone. And it's not that it's less documentation. And actually, really with bank statements, you find more about people, not me, but the underwriters would find more about people's spending habits. It's a safer loan to do when a business owner is doing that, or that's how they spend their money, but they don't want to give it all to the IRS. So we have ways to work around that. And so bringing those options to this area, particularly for self-employed, I thought was a really great opportunity because we're not going off that bank criteria. Now, for some people, that's a better loan for them. But there's a lot of other options that we can do that really opens up more closings for the real estate agents when you have more opportunities, when you can get a little bit out of the box or help people find the right program for them for exactly what they're looking for. We just don't have limitations on that, which is great.
Before you got into the mortgage industry, what brought you to that industry? How'd you get into it?
Misery. It was misery. No, so my history, I grew up in the horse industry.
Okay, yeah, I remember you mentioned this.
Yeah. So I was homeschooled, and when I was 13 years old, I took an apprenticeship at a horse farm, and I did that my whole life. I can clean a stall like nobody's business. I can drive a tractor. Manual labor was really my deal. And in 2008, my sister and I purchased a horse farm. January 1st of 2008, just as the whole world went into financial crisis, and by 2010, we were pretty much bankrupt. There's just not going. Everything skyrocketed. The feed, the hay, all of the stuff. So we made a decision to go ahead and get out of that business. And, it's not a real transferable skill, it turns out, shoveling horse manure. And so, I took a couple little odd jobs just to kind of, make ends meet and kind of get through things. And I took a job at a company. It was not great. It was probably like maybe one of those things where you always have the worst job you've ever been in. Like, just
worst boss.
The worst. And I kind of got recruited like as an afterthought, like, hey, would you think you'd be interested in it? And I said, whatever I have to do to get out of this, I'm in.
Yeah.
And so I didn't really know what I was getting into, but I was really willing to do that. And so I dove in all the way, like whatever I had to do to learn, whatever it took to make it happen.
Is that when you first, because I think I mentioned this in the intro, you're very well read. Like all the great business books, I feel like you've read them.
Oh,
and
yeah.
when they come up in our Tuesday morning meeting, you're always recommending a book that I'm like, yes, I know that book and it's an amazing book. Like, did it start? Is that when that started or?
Well, you know what? It started with that, but it started because that thing where people say you are the sum of the 5 people that you hang around the most. That was not a very good quality surrounding for me. So I thought, well, I can at least make books, podcasts, people who are doing it like that. That's what I kind of surrounded myself with.
And what was your like big picture at this point? Like in the terms of like you're telling me about how hungry you were. Was it just trying to like get to a point of like financial stability? Like what?
Just financial stability. Yeah. Just really getting to that place where financial stability, being a little bit of an expert in my field and helping people understand a concept that is difficult to understand is what I love to do. And mortgages, very often people come into the mortgage process terrified. And if I can make them feel confident and feel like they are somewhat in control and understand what's going on, that's what I want to do. Yeah.
So 10 years in, I feel like 10 years feels like a lifetime in this industry. Like I think about when I first bought my house, that was in 2018, I think. And I feel like just between 2018 and when I sold it in 2022, it feels like black and white, like totally different markets. But even like 5 years prior to that, it felt a lot different too. What's it like being in an industry that has so much change? Constant changing.
You really have to be willing to be flexible and adapt all the time. This is not an industry that you get to sit in and go, okay, well, I figured that out. And you have to change. I mean, I see a lot of people, especially loan officers who have been in the business a long time, who have a fatigue right now with the way that the market is going because it's changed again in a major way. And what they have to do.
What are we referring to when you say that?
We're really referring to how business gets done. So, for instance, and a lot of to be a great loan officer 5 years ago, 6 years ago, you probably had a handful of really great realtors that gave you multiple deals a year, and it wasn't a lot. What they're finding now is what used to be a mile deep and inch wide is now a mile wide and inch deep. You've got to keep relationships and keep growing relationships and keep getting out there. And that is very uncomfortable for some loan officers who have been really comfortable being in the office and not having to go out and make new relationships or cultivate new relationships and be out there. And so there's a fatigue in some of these some of these loan officers that have been around for a long time, that making that pivotal switch again to going out there and realizing that you've got to have, where you used to have 10, you have to have probably 50 or 60. And it's interesting to watch that. And the funny thing, on the flip side of that, if you talk to loan officers who've been in the business 2 years and they have no past history, they are doing better than those people who have been in the business for a long time. Because they
don't have, and it's probably not fair to call them bad habits, but
no ingrained habits.
Yeah. Right. It's like when you live in a culture where you have to learn to sell and you've never had to do that before. It's not necessarily a bad habit that you didn't, but I think I loved you pointing out this nuance of people who are like coming into their own in today's economy, circumstances, whatever. And it's something else we've talked about too. One thing I've always really liked about you is whenever we have like conversations about the state of the economy or just like all the noise of what's happening, I love how ambitious you are and how just in control your mindset is on. And you had a comment just for our listeners, we were talking about, and for our listeners, you've all heard this expression before, well, it's the economy. Well, it's, and also talking to fellow business owners, people who say, oh, well, no one's buying, it's just because of the state of things or what have you. And I think it's one of the most dangerous things you can say, because you've now decided that your customers are not going to buy from you, when maybe they will. But getting back to my long-winded point, we talked about this conversation point, and then you mentioned you had a line that has really stuck with me. And I was driving the other day and it popped in my head again. And that's what led me to reaching out to you. You said something along the lines of, yes, the economy is X, Y, and Z, but I guess I'm just going to have to work harder than you. I guess I'm just going to have to make it happen, really. And I love that mentality. It's a bit awkward to be like, where did that come from? Because it sounds like that's just part of your DNA.
Oh no, that's definitely the books in the pocket. Okay. This is the 5 people you surround yourself with. I mean, I hate to say that. Like, there's a little part of me that really wishes I could have been a Navy SEAL. Not that I would have made it through BUD/S probably, but I love that mentality of just whatever it takes. And sometimes it's hard. And I like to have influences of people who go through tougher times than I go through, because I realize whatever it is I have to give, it's actually a little bit more than what I think. Mm-hmm. And not to burn out. I'm pretty good about some, self-care, but there's always a little bit more. And in that limiting belief of, I've given everything and I can't go, or that there's no choice because the economy stinks. My favorite line is, I like to stay optimistically delusional.
Yes, I love that line.
Yeah, because I don't want to hear how bad it is. Because it doesn't matter, because what I do have control over is getting out there and making relationships, getting out there and making friends, getting out there and bringing the brand to this area that's never seen it. Mm-hmm. Because our company is quite large. We have a stadium. It is soccer. It's not, no offense to the soccer players, but our company's it's a big company. Yeah. But you show up around here and they go, never heard of Lower Local. Are you like a mom and pop shop? And it's not at all the case. But trying not to have the preconceived ideas or the limiting beliefs of what I can bring to this area and what I can do to move that forward in the brand is, I just have to stay optimistically delusional.
And I think I think it's so easy to fall into this trap too. Like, news in general is fairly negative.
Yeah, can't subscribe.
Yeah, right. But I think what's really funny about this is, it's funny to me how certain storylines become so mainstream, in the sense of, like, the news media or people online or social media, everyone's saying things like nobody's buying right now. So you fall into that trap of thinking that.
Right.
And the one thing that was kind of a incredible insight for me was, I remember during COVID, and it's not to say that businesses weren't totally destroyed during COVID. Absolutely. It was a really painful time for many businesses, but there was absolutely this thing of, like, no one's making money, no one's doing well, yada, yada. Well, then I was on a call with one of my customers, and they were like, yeah, we just finished our biggest year ever post-COVID. Now, they were a real estate company, which did really well.
They did really well. That's crazy. That's a crazy time.
I think they were up 20% from their all-time high in, like, the history of their business. And it was this really interesting, like, aha moment for me of, like, well, wait a second, maybe there's more to this conversation than just no one's making money, no one's doing well. Like, here's someone who has figured out how to do well, how to make money despite the circumstances.
Yeah, and I really do think, again, optimistically delusional, but I really do think that what you allow your mind to dwell on in those ways absolutely has everything to do with your daily activities, your daily habits, all of that stuff. And it's not that I'm so self-disciplined, because there's certainly room for growth in a lot of ways, but I just am really careful about what I allow my mind to focus on, because I want to hear, all I want to know is that people are doing it. Somebody's going to do it.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Somebody's going to do it.
Yeah, that's right.
So I'm going to do it.
Yeah. And the way I see it, I love this. It's someone's making money. Yep. Like, someone is going to make money. Yep. And someone's business is going to be successful, despite the circumstances. Someone's going to figure it out.
Exactly.
And so for me, it's like, well, I'm going to be one of those people for sure.
Yep. And I'm going to do the work for what it takes to make that happen.
So not to dip our toes into maybe a controversial topic, but friends and family.
Yeah.
What is your immediate circle like in terms of supporting what you're doing? Well, that's a weird question. It's not like, does your husband support your job? It's more of this trend that comes up in the entrepreneurial circles of when the economy's bad, you have family members, you have friends who are like, wow, yeah, it must be really hard. Like a good example for me, and it's not to say that my business, I haven't had hard seasons or even hard months, but I've had literally the best year ever for my business. So it's just really funny when people are like, hey, so how's it going?
Oh yeah.
And they have kind of like, they're immediately like very sad, it seems like, for me. They're like, are you doing okay? And I'm like, yeah, it's going great. Or go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, one of the, a great story on that actually is usually when you're working really hard, and you've probably faced this a little bit, especially in the entrepreneurial space, you will have friends and family who get a little convicted and don't really feel comfortable with your level of drive.
Yes. Or risk.
And that can be really challenging. And my best friend called me one day and she was like, she was real sympathetic, but not in a good way. Like, oh, you need to take time. You need to give yourself a break. And went through this whole thing. And I remember it was right here at Growth Group. And I walked in and I thought, I don't know if I can talk to her anymore if she's going to talk to me like that, because that's not where I'm going.
Yeah.
I am, I'm exactly where I want to be, and I don't need the break. I don't need the day of self-care right now. And I'm not saying that people don't need that.
No, I'm with you.
But at that moment, I just didn't. And when I left Growth Group and I got back in the car, she called me. She goes, "I'm really sorry I said that to you."
Wow.
She said, "I know that's not where you're at." And I thought, that's incredible. And I'm really grateful that she recognized that. But it was because she wouldn't want to push herself in that moment, wouldn't want to push herself to that level. But she knew that's where I was.
Well, and it's hard as people to give advice that's agnostic from what we ourselves are going through. Yeah, exactly. And I've just found that the world of business ownership and like entrepreneurship is it's such a deep valley of risk. Like you're navigating risk constantly in terms of when's the next sale coming in? What does cash flow look like? A new hire, how are they going to do? All these different questions that are always up in your, that you're thinking about. And what I have found is that many people, and it's not necessarily good or bad, I've just found that many people do not either have an appetite for risk, or they don't have circumstances where risk is a common factor, like day to day. So I think this is a bit of the challenge of business is sometimes you're constantly getting perspectives and advice from people that you, one, never necessarily asked for,
right?
But two, I think understanding how to navigate that advice on, is this actually good advice for me or is it not good advice for me? Your comment made me think of a friend of mine who reached out to me and said, "Hey, Blake, I really think you should take like 2 weeks off." And I just thought I can't even take a day. I mean, I could take maybe a day off, but that'd be insanity for me.
Right.
Now, where he was coming from, was I totally get it.
Sure.
It wasn't
out of love. I mean, not out of love.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Right. It was, he wants what's best for me, but I have to have, and I think also when I make those decisions, I'm also comfortable with 2 years down the road being like, okay, yeah, that was right. I made a mistake.
Sure.
So,
one of the things I've thought a lot about this week, us as human beings, we really like that comfort of certainty. What I've kind of been noticing in myself recently is that the level of uncertainty that you're willing to live with, you can't have the really excited joy and excitement for the future and hope, like that really, that expansive moment of just feeling hopeful does not come without extreme uncertainty. You can't have those two without the other. And so I think a lot of times we want to avoid uncertainty, but it also really shuts down that joy and that hope for the future and the excitement for what is tomorrow going to bring. You just don't get those two things without the other. But most people don't want to live with uncertainty. And that's what we live with. I think very often when you're starting something new or starting a business, there is no certainty. But you also kind of miss that really exciting joy and hope of what's coming up.
And it's hard for me to imagine life in a 9-to-5 again, in the sense of 9-to-5 is the wrong way to put it, but like I don't know. It's hard to imagine not having that. Maybe I'm just like
there's a bit of an addiction there, isn't there?
Maybe I'm a glutton for punishment or something, or I don't know. But so you have people who, they want to buy a home. They're thinking about their next, getting property, whatever.
Sure.
And there is some uncertainty there sometimes in terms of, what's going to happen to the market, and how do you help people who maybe don't have that appetite for uncertainty? I mean, you're obviously very well gifted in your field, so I'm sure that already speaks volumes, but what does that look like when you have someone who comes to you and they're like, you can just tell they're a little green to all of this?
Sure. Yeah, statistically, 54% of first-time home buyers say that applying for the mortgage loan is their biggest fear.
Wow.
So just coming into that, they're afraid coming into the situation. I mean, you've been through it, you know, and even going through it as a professional, it's funny how that perspective you have, like when a day goes by and you haven't heard anything. What does that mean?
Yeah.
But my favorite thing is when we have this moment and we start the conversation out and you can feel that trepidation, you can feel that concern and fear and just what is this going to be like? Am I going to be able to qualify? And then towards the end of the conversation, and it happens, there's just like this deep breath that just kind of goes, okay, I understand. I'm good with that. And just being able to kind of recognize that in people, even people who have been through the process, being able to recognize that they're a little bit afraid, they're a little bit excited, they're nervous, they don't know what's going to happen, and the market has changed even since last time you've done it, you know, all of those things, and being able to just listen to what it is that they're needing in that moment, and it's often just a little bit of reassurance. It's saying, this is not as uncertain as you think it is. Here's what we've already gone through. I've already looked at all of these documents. And so when I say you can go buy a house, barring some wild event, there's really no reason that we should have any fear going through the process. I've already looked at everything. And so taking that uncertainty out of it and taking a little bit of that fear out of it, and also making them helping them understand what the process looks like step by step, where we're going to talk, where we're not going to talk, you know, what's the next time that we're going to have a conversation and how's that going to look? It immediately resolves a lot of that for them. And so then we are more collaborative through the whole process, which is always beneficial for me.
Yeah, I remember being really anxious because I was like, this is like the next 30 years.
Oh,
like,
gosh.
This is a big purchase. And I think the house we bought, you're never going to find a house that costs this now, but I think it was $200,000, I think, for our house. Dream first home. Yeah. We adored that house. We live near it, so we drive by it every day. So maybe I'm just a little,
sentimental.
Yeah. So... but it was a $200,000 house. And I just remember through the whole loan process being like, this is more money than I've could ever consider spending on something. Yeah. But also my very first interaction with it, I didn't know where to get a loan from. I didn't know how the whole process worked. So Google was like informing me this whole way.
Sure.
But I remember the first mortgage lender I went to, I had set up this appointment, set up this meeting. And then the day of the meeting, I didn't see an email he sent me, which was, oh, by the way, make sure you bring this form filled out. And so I get there and he says, do you have your form? And I say, oh no, I didn't see the form. And he gave me this very sassy, well, I guess, what do you even want to do today then? And I was like, well, I'm assuming you probably have a copy of the form.
Just fill it out.
Right? Like, and he basically said something along the lines of like, well, that'd be kind of a waste of both of our times. And I was like, this was a waste of a meeting. This is interesting.
Yeah.
But interactions like that made the whole process even more just nerve-wracking of like, man, what am I really... This person's signaling to me that I clearly don't know what I'm doing.
Right. I had a similar experience when I bought my first house. And that really informed a lot of how I handle first-time home buyers. It was not a bad... I mean, the loan officer was great. But it was like, fill out the online application. Okay, great. All right, you're pre-approved for this much. And I was like, to heck I am.
Yeah.
I am not spending that much on a house because I knew that was not comfortable for me.
Yeah.
That's a huge point. Like, what are you actually comfortable spending compared to what are you qualified for? Very often you qualify for more than you're comfortable with. And so I just remember sitting at the closing table signing things, and I don't know. I was just signing. I thought, well, I assume people do this all the time.
Yeah.
I hope that this is okay. Great. I bought a house. Now what do I do? And even though looking back, because of course I went through that paperwork, looking back, everything was done really well. I felt completely, my choice and my understanding of it was never there. And I really felt like that could have been done a lot better. And so,
talking about the other side of the same coin, you're also in an industry where the realtor, there's a difference between like the actual this is going to sound so rude this is no shade to our realtor friends, but the real realtors and the person who like saw an ad on Facebook of like, start your next career. It's all this money. Just get your real estate license. Just go to this weekend course. And, we have 4,000 realtors. I think even more than that, maybe.
I think a little bit more.
In Northwest Arkansas. What's it like working with people who have very different levels of experience, but also levels of maybe focus is the word, or intentionality, in that it's like their main gig, like this is what I do, versus the person who they have like their job and like the real estate thing's a thing on the side?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I treat everybody fairly, but not necessarily equally, if that makes sense, when it comes to time. And
that makes sense.
But I want everybody, everybody sort of gets a fair shot. But there are some people, and you can tell when they're really hungry and they're new. I'm going to help. I'm going to do everything I can help them, to get ahead and to be more informed, and to help them even with some of their sales, books or suggestions and things like that. And then some are just, they're already out there making it happen, and they're making it happen in a really strong way. But this comes down to, and we've talked about this lots in the growth group, is knowing your customer. So not only do we have like the customer on the mortgage side of, people who come to us, but really our primary customer is the realtors. And you have to align in values. You have to align in all of those things to really give that customer experience the best customer experience they can have. Because if you come across, like, what they want to know as a mortgage customer when they come to a realtor and lending team, is that you guys are a team, that they've done a good job picking their realtor, they've done a good job picking their mortgage professional, and being able to supply that with some congruency is really important. And the only way to do that is to find people who are aligned with you, in vision and in business activities and how they manage customers and and sometimes they don't. I've had to back myself out of realtor relationships because at the end it was a nightmare for the customer, whether the loan process went super smooth or not. Their experience was terrible. And so I had to kind of back out of some to just say, this is not good for me ultimately professionally, because I'm never, for a mortgage professional in the next 11 years, if I close somebody today, in the next 11 years, 4 transactions usually are on the table to the tune of roughly $11,000 or more in commissions. So long-term customer care and long-term customer retention is extremely important. And so if they had a terrible experience, even if it wasn't you, you'll never see them again. I
love that you mentioned this, by the way, because I feel like this is like the secret sauce for long-term business, is understanding customer retention. And I've noticed that that some people are so sales oriented, of like, on to the next one, on to the next one, on to the next one, that they give a crummy experience to the person who bought from them. And I don't think anyone's as overt to be like, well, I got mine. You paid me. Like, what do I care?
Right.
I think people are just maybe so busy or not, they don't have the attention to detail that they need. But I love that you have this similar appreciation for doing a good enough job that person's a customer for life.
Yeah. And establishing that up front, some of that, like, early sales anchoring, like, I'm here for you I'm here for you forever.
Yes.
Whatever I can do and going a little bit above and beyond to help them in ways that aren't necessarily specifically mortgage related, checking in to make sure they got their homestead exemption. Like, all of that stuff is really important. And just to make sure that they know that through that initial process, you took great care of them, and you intend to always take great care of them, so that you can have that long-term checking in with them, at least once a year or more, because the cost of acquiring that customer is so expensive. But again, going back to the 2 customers, so we got the actual person getting the mortgage, and then the realtor. What a value you can bring when you keep in touch with that customer, and then a year or so down the road, we know a lot of people are not great at follow up, and very often the personality that creates the realtor is not the one that wants to do a lot of paperwork and like be super detail oriented. But if you can say, oh great, you're looking at a new house, why don't I get you in touch with that that realtor that did a great job for you, and they're like, oh, thanks so much. Bringing that back. What a value,
And what I like about this conversation too is it really doesn't take much to create like those intentional touch points. Like you mentioned calling someone, I guess my camera just died. You mentioned calling someone once a year. That's a 15-minute phone call once a year with someone. The other ones I like too is like snail mail. I'm a big fan of snail mail.
Yeah, that's not dead.
And just sending like a handwritten note.
Absolutely.
And for people listening, a lot of the stuff, I think it gets a bad rap in that it's like, well, that's too simple. Does that really make a difference?
No. Yeah.
And it's amazing. It's amazing the difference it makes when you're intentional. And like you said, I think sometimes we don't see the forest for the trees and we don't realize how freaking expensive a new customer is. Not just in terms of like pure cost, especially if you're running any kind of advertising, but also just the energy and effort you put in to build trust with that person.
Yes.
Why would you keep that to just one transaction?
Right. Exactly. So I teach a database class to real estate agents, I do those classes. And one of the things that we break down in that class is if you've got a customer database of 500 and you need to touch each one of those 2 times a year, it really basically boils down to 2 phone calls a day. 2 phone calls a day during a 5-day work week. Everybody can make 2 phone calls a day to keep up with 500 people in their database. Is really nothing. And when you break it down to that level, you go, okay, this is not an overwhelming thing.
And I think sometimes like we make it harder than it has to be. I think there's people listening who are like panicking at the idea of 2 phone calls. But again, like putting constraints on it, you're not having 2-hour phone calls.
No.
Have you read the book How to Win Friends and Influence People?
Yeah.
Which for our listeners, we honestly should have just gone through a bunch of books today.
Yeah. What are our favorite reads?
The great thing about How to Win Friends and Influence People is you're getting what you want by framing it in their benefit. So what you want is a phone call that's not going to take 10 hours to have a conversation with someone. The way you frame it is, hey, I know your time's really valuable, so I won't keep you more than a few minutes. And then you just have like a 5-minute converssion. Hey, I know you're busy. Let me get off the phone so that you can get back to what's important to you. And
it's not a sale like we were talking about earlier.
Yes.
You're not pigeonholing them into another sale. You're just simply checking in to make sure there's, and giving the value of listening to see if there's a need that you can meet, even, just a small little need. That goes a long, long way. Yeah.
Unfortunately, the industry that I get after the most on this topic is insurance companies, because I literally just switched my insurance company. I had this insurance company for maybe 4 years. I have literally never heard from them, except for with the annual time to re-up. And then my renter's insurance company, I could not even tell you who they are.
Yeah.
I don't even know who they are.
Yeah.
Because the person that I bought it from ended up selling the agency. But I can tell you that whenever, and so the way that I ended up changing was a friend of mine was helping my neighbor change her insurance. And I thought, well, I go and just change mine too. And the point behind this is I'd be a lot less likely to do that if I actually had any relationship at all with my insurance agent, rather than, this once a year, please buy from me conversation.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So anyway, Jenny, we are out of time today. It was so good having you on the podcast. What's the best way for people to follow up with you or reach out to you?
So you can find me on Facebook. It's Jenny Wellington, Lower Local NWA. I should have really practiced that a little bit. Yeah,
I'll put the link. The link will be in the episode description for people.
Facebook is really where I spend most of my time. They always say focus on the one that you're going to do the most business on. And then, of course, you can call me at 479-877-0350 if you have any questions about mortgage lending, and I'm always happy to answer that. Even if I'm not your lender, I'm happy to just look things over and give you an honest appraisal.
And I see a lot of your great advice on Facebook too.
Oh, thank you.
So, anyway. Well, Jenny, thanks again. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Blake.
Hey, for our listeners, if you're a first-time listener, what the heck are you waiting on? Click that subscribe or follow button so you can keep getting good advice wherever you are. Don't forget that if you've ever thought about supporting the podcast, you can go to our Patreon, patreon.com/goodadvice, or you can advertise your business on the podcast as well. You can reach out Blake at goodadvicecoaching.com. For those of you who've listened to the podcast long-term and supported the podcast, thank you so much. That's today's good advice. We'll catch you later. See ya.